director of the college writing program here at AU. And I'd like to first welcome my faculty colleagues from the college writing program. You'll be seeing some of them later tonight. Far more to the point, though, I want to share a welcome from the college writing program and the College of Arts and Sciences to the class of 2019. We know that you've been talking about Jessica Alexander and Chasing Chaos in your college writing courses over the last week or so. With the Writer as Witness program tonight, we continue those conversations. A couple of weeks ago, I'm sure you recall, you sat in this same arena with those blue t-shirts, remember, for convocation. You may remember President Kerwin's call for you that you do well and that you do good. And Professor Angela Davis at that event predicted that some of your intellectual experiences will make you uncomfortable. It seems to me that with this book, Jessica Alexander is chronicling a way of doing the former, and she's happy to make us a little uncomfortable in the process. Not a bad one-line description of a successful college education, I think. She's also, Angela Davis at that event also implored you to ask questions. We echo that tonight. A word on logistics. Following Jessica Alexander's talk to us tonight, she's graciously agreed to field your questions. We have 3 college writing professors in the audience. Let's see where you are. Professor Mary Switalski here. Professor, yeah, right. Professor Adam Tamaszewski there. Oh, really? Professor Amanda Chowka here. When you're called upon to ask a question, please introduce yourself and tell us where you're from. In a moment, I'll turn over the program to Lynn Stallings, our Vice Provost for Undergraduate Studies and a professor in the Department of Mathematics. That's kind of a long, complicated title, I know, but in many ways it just comes down to this. Lynn Stallings is in charge of the academic explorations that you've recently begun. In a significant way, she's in charge of the reason you came to AU in the first place, our undergraduate academic education. Under her leadership, the Office of Undergrad Studies is dedicated to ensuring an unsurpassed education for all of you, and she works overseeing many of the units and cohorts that some of American University Honors, the Frederick Douglass Distinguished Scholars Program, our General Education Program, University College, AU Scholars, Community-Based Learning, the list goes on. Dr. Stallings served as chair of the Faculty Senate here at AU in 2009, was recognized the next year when she received the American University Award for Outstanding Service. Early on in Dr. Stallings' tenure here at AU, she received the award for Outstanding Teaching. She received her PhD from the University of Southern Mississippi, specializing in secondary mathematics education and research. Finally, a personal note. I often get to attend meetings with Lynn Stallings. Often we talk about what we should do about this or that issue, this or that program. Her standard guidance is to make sure that at every turn we're considering what will be best for undergraduates at American University. I've heard her say it many times. Wait a minute, is that a good idea for our students? That's what guides her. You are, to say the least, in very good hands. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lynn Stallings.
Knocking over bottles of water, you can see I have a drinking problem. Good. That's good. That's what we need. That was too long an introduction when the star of the show is sitting right behind me. So, the star of the show, and I know all of us are very happy that Jessica Alexander is here. So I'm going to keep this very short so that you can learn as much as you can from Jessica, who's provided an honest and unreserved portrait of humanitarian aid. You read her bio, so I won't repeat that, but what you may not know is that she has a dual master's degree in international studies. And public health. And she's currently working on her PhD. So I'm just going to point out that she's not only providing for you a realistic picture of the boots on the ground experience of humanitarian aid, but implicit in what she is providing is the educational foundation needed to move effectively in that field. Recall that this began with the decision to go to Central America alone. It was that experience that informed her decision to pursue aid work. After a little toe dipping, I loved her lessons that she shares early in the book on pages 18 and 20. Through number 1, I had no idea what jobs entailed or what it meant to be qualified for one. And if I was planning to stay in this field, maybe a master's degree wasn't a bad idea after all. So take in all of what Jessica has to offer, but keep in mind that her most significant contributions were grounded in the ability to do research and to communicate effectively. As first-year students at American University, you can begin to build your foundations for research and communications right now. It's yours for the taking. So everybody, please welcome Jessica Alexander.
Thank you, and thank you both. So I'm so honored and excited to be here tonight. If I can get the mic. Okay. And really thank you to the committee for selecting Chasing Chaos for American University's First Read program. I got the news that the book had been selected for the First Read months ago, sitting in my office at the United Nations in Geneva, where I currently work, and was thrilled to know that the book would be landing in the hands of so many smart, ambitious, and already successful young people. I wrote the book with people like you in mind, people who were starting out their academic and soon-to-be professional tracks, to give you a sense not only of the humanitarian world, but also the many opportunities that exist for intellectual, professional, and personal engagement, both during and after your college time. So you sit here tonight so fortunate to be embarking on 4 years at a top university in a vibrant city with so much to offer. Now the world has changed a lot since I was sitting in your places, standing in your shoes, on the first days of college. And I don't need to worry about outing myself about how old I am or aging myself, as the book has obviously done that. But I went to school before email existed, when I wrote papers in a computer lab because laptops, we didn't have laptops where they were like 20 pounds, and so you couldn't really carry them around. I took notes for class in a spiral notebook with like a pen and paper instead of on the laptop. Way before Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Tinder, none of that stuff existed. No one had cell phones. I have no idea how we made plans, although I remember that people would like print out parties that were hung on a poster in our dorm room. And so this may sound like the dark ages to you, it certainly does to me, even reading it here. But many of the things that you're experiencing are probably very similar to what I was. I was excited, but also totally terrified. People sending me off to college, filling me with all kinds of expectations, and it was hard to live up to these swirling notions of how amazing college was going to be, and to know what to expect. But I hope you're all settling in nicely, have found the nearest 24-hour deli, and are wearing flip-flops in the shower. So my book, Chasing Chaos, left you nearly 6 years ago since the Haiti earthquake. Since then, I've continued working in the humanitarian system for the UN, both in New York and now in Geneva, where I live. I still travel to the field, but my life has taken a much less chaotic turn in the sense that I'm no longer hopping from one crisis to another, physically chasing chaos. And I've settled in Geneva, and 3 weeks ago, I gave birth to twins. Thank you. So I think the title for my next book will be Chaos Bound. This time it's personal. But aside from life changing a lot for me personally, the world has also changed a lot since 2010, the year of the Haiti earthquake. And tonight I'd like to bring you up to speed a bit about the world in which humanitarians are working today, the challenges but also opportunities that we face. And I'll also be sharing tonight insights about how I came to write this book, why I wrote it, and some advice I can impart on the writing process. So as you know, I launched my career in this field shortly after I graduated college, having entered without a clue that this profession even really existed. To me, at the time, it was all volunteerism. I was pretty confident that I could make a difference, but humble enough to know that while I personally may not be able to change the world, this industry I was embarking in, this profession I was choosing and dedicating myself to could. And as you read, that although my optimism and wide-eyed enthusiasm was tempered almost immediately, it's taken me years of working in this field to recognize what bringing humanitarian aid to people actually means, the limits and the possibilities, and my understanding of what it takes to do that has become more grounded in the complex realities of today's crises. It feels as if we've reached a pivotal moment in the world's history, where every day the news features terrorism, conflict, and humanitarian crisis. The number of people being targeted for humanitarian assistance has doubled since 2004 to over 70 million in 2014. And the list of countries in crisis grows longer. Syria, South Sudan, Iraq, Central African Republic, Yemen, Somalia, the Ebola outbreak, which had such a devastating impact on Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. And while the spread of disease has been tempered, these countries are still years away from social and economic recovery. People are flooding the shores of Europe, many dying along the way, seeking refuge from the atrocities at home. Think about how desperate you would have to be to pack yourself and your family onto a flimsy raft across the Mediterranean, knowing full well how many people have perished on the same route to find safety and protection. By the end of 2014, more than 38 million people were internally displaced by armed conflict and violence, with the average time a person spends in internal displacement 17 years, which is about your entire lifetime. There are more displaced people today than since the end of World War II. These are truly challenging times when humanitarian actors are being called on more and more to deal with the consequences of crises that have their roots in conflict, political differences, and push for power. And the lines between civilians and combatants have become increasingly blurred, while today's battlefield has moved to populated areas and urban centers. Conflict and displacement are terrible experiences for anyone, but they pose the most serious risks to those who are the least able to protect themselves, children. And the impact on them is enormous. Sometimes with only a few hours' notice, they have to abandon everything they know: their homes, communities, their schools, their friends, their aspirations. Only 1 in 2 Syrian refugee children in the neighboring countries is receiving education, and many receive only informal education, short of required standards. I recently visited some of these informal education centers in Lebanon and Jordan and was shocked by how rudimentary these settings were, and also the number of children that I saw who weren't able to enroll in school at all. When I spoke with their parents, all they repeated was a desire for their children to have access to education so that they could have a future. Before the conflict in Syria, nearly every child was enrolled in primary school, and by 2013, close to 2 million of them were out of school. It took just 2 years of civil war to erase all education progress made since the start of the century. And if you multiply that across the millions of Syrian children going without schooling, think about what that does to an entire generation and how hard it is for a nation to rebuild when its youth haven't been educated. The challenge facing humanitarian organizations to provide assistance not only to these children, but to women and men who have experienced humanitarian crisis, either due to conflict or natural disaster, has never been greater. And our work is increasingly dangerous. Challenges posed by conflict and extreme levels of violence against civilians and aid workers mean that, with some notable exceptions, international humanitarian workers like me can no longer operate safely in many conflict-affected countries, as the instruments and rational arguments that were designed to protect us are being disrespected or outright violated. Last year broke a record, with 336 aid workers attacked, the overwhelming majority of them being staff from the countries themselves. Humanitarian supplies are looted, be it Afghanistan, Syria, or Mali, and each time a hospital is attacked or an aid convoy looted, a huge swath of affected people lose the opportunity to secure much-needed assistance. In Central African Republic, where 16 people, including 3 MSF, or Doctors Without Borders staff, were killed in an attack on a hospital in April last year, they had to suspend all but its most vital operations, and as a result, in just 1 week, some 25,000 outpatient consultations did not take place. So with these realities, it would be very easy to get depressed, to think that the challenge of providing humanitarian relief was too much, not even for one person, but for an entire humanitarian industry. But I don't. Why? Because although I see the very worst of what we as human beings can do to each other, I also see the very best. People managing in the most difficult circumstances. I see solidarity. I see communities and people being innovative and entrepreneurial in finding ways to survive. I see people with almost nothing being prepared to share what they have, holding their families and communities together. I see people laughing and living, getting married and sharing meals, celebrating being alive after being so close to death. What we so often overlook in humanitarian crises is that local people are often not only the first responders, but often the most capable responders. And if I've learned anything from my time working in this field, it's that these people are not sitting around waiting for the international community to swoop in and save the day. If you walk through any refugee or displaced persons camp, you'll find doctors, teachers, nurses, engineers, people with expertise. Yet the media so often portrays them as helpless victims. Last year I visited Tacloban in the Philippines, where families impacted by Typhoon Haiyan were still living in temporary shelters, their fishing villages washed away, and with it all of their possessions. They returned back to their communities that day, and as one person told me, we went back to our homes. We took our roofs, which were lying on the ground, we took out the nails, flattened out the corrugated metal, and began rebuilding. We're not sitting back and waiting for anyone. If we are still alive, we will get back to our lives. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, communities who were displaced over and over by conflict and climate-related disasters, they often run to the safety of their neighboring communities with whom they live and get support. I wondered if I would be as generous with people coming to my town over and over, using resources of my community. And when I asked host families why they did it, they said, we thought of what we experienced. We were displaced and hosted by others, so we must help them as we were helped. I met a woman who was struggling to feed 5 of her own children, taken 3 more. The solidarity these communities show is a remarkable display of human spirit. I think I came into this field thinking that I could help them, but in fact, people are the best resources to help themselves. Of course with help, but the conception of help is changing. No longer is it accepted or wished for international actors without knowledge of the context, understanding of the culture to swoop in and save the day. People don't want a hand out, they want a hand up. A hand up so that they can meet their own needs, that they can provide for their children. In every village, whether it is Syrian refugees displaced by war, Filipinos rebuilding their lives after a devastating typhoon, villagers from conflict-ridden Somalia, when you ask them what's most important for their lives, they'll tell you they want the most basic of things. Safety, security, education for their children, decent health care, and a right to be treated with respect and dignity. We're also operating today in a more interconnected world than ever, where these people can communicate their situations and express their needs to the world. Human rights violations happening in far places are only one YouTube video away from being shared. Injustices and human catastrophe are only a viral tweet away from the entire world knowing and launching a reaction. Look at the Bring Home Our Girls campaign for the women captured by Boko Haram. Humanitarians sifted through 440,000 tweets that were generated within 48 hours of Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines to help identify needs. The world is jolted into action. over the current refugee crisis because a photo of a little boy found on the Turkish shores is shared thousands of times on social media. Today, events in a remote village in the Congo are documented because someone there has a cell phone. That woman who just lost her family due to a barrel bomb in Syria has a Facebook account. That community in Nepal who's just devastated by the earthquake can upload photos showing the world their loss. News is more and more generated from affected people themselves, and their voices and perspectives are being heard and registered not only by us, the humanitarian community, but by you, the general public. But it's easy to feel overwhelmed. I hope you walked away after reading my book with a sense of the world and how the humanitarian industry works, a sense of these people, the individuals who experience these kind of crises. So often, when I came back from working abroad, I found my friends and families, smart and interested people, people who read the newspaper, who were informed about world affairs, lacking an understanding of the reality that humanitarians face, the real-life stories of people affected by crisis, and the inspiring moments of resilience and triumph. These images and stories have always stayed with me, but they're hard to understand from afar. This was one of the reasons I came to write the book in the first place, so that you, when people at home read about these things in the newspaper, see a link on Facebook, read a tweet, you're reminded of the individuals, the families, the unique experiences of people, so they aren't lumped together into one massive human suffering that you can become apathetic to. I hope you'll be able to put faces on those statistics. Remember that once the cameras turn off, that the humanitarian crisis is not over. It's usually just the beginning. I hope you'll remember that woman I wrote about in Haiti, building a beauty parlor out of rubble to get on with her life. I hope you'll remember Ahmed, my friend in Darfur, who was ready to walk across the Sahara Desert for 3 days on the back of a donkey to get his niece medical treatment. I hope you'll remember that little boy in Sierra Leone who begged me to help him remove the initials of the rebel group that were carved into his chest. That you'll think about the Ugandan man I interviewed in Rwanda who was desperate to reunite his daughter with her mother. These are the people affected by crisis. These are the people working to restore normalcy, trying to build a future for themselves, and we as humanitarians are humbled to be working with them. So how did I come to write this book? Well, the truth is, I never really set out to write a book in the first place. It came to me because people asked me dozens of questions when I came home, and I realized that there was a vacuum of accessible writing out there about where humanitarians worked and the people who lived there. Sure, you could read the newspaper, but telling the stories, the universal ones of both suffering and hope of people affected by crisis were hard to come by. And it wasn't easy for me to distill the experience I had, the work that I did, and the people with whom I worked into pithy anecdotes I could rattle off at parties and social gatherings. And I had never found a book out there that I could refer people to find out more. Toni Morrison has said, if there's a book that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. Whether it's fiction or nonfiction, if you're reading and the book you want to read isn't out there, then that's a reason a book needs to exist. And this was the reason enough for me. But I had to know that reason, because I returned and returned to it as my guiding light. It's what kept me going through the entire process, as I felt that the book had fallen on me to write, and there was so much I wanted to explain and demystify about humanitarian aid. Given how involved Americans were in fundraising for humanitarian disaster responses, I wanted to provide insight into where people's money went when they donated and how best they could help. I wanted to provide a realistic perspective about the day-to-day reality, that a lot of this work takes place in an office and not out in the field. The loneliness and frustrations that come with living in some of the most troubled places on earth. The way that this line of work can erode your sense of home and belonging. I certainly had no clue when I started out what I was in for, and probably would have gotten a lot out of a book like this. So when I finally sat down to write something, there were a few things that saved me during the process. Some things I had instinctively done, and others which I had been advised. For one, I was an avid journal keeper when I was in the field, and wrote long notes about what I was seeing, experiencing, people I met, and what fascinated me about them. I kept a notebook with me at all times, jotting down every kind of observation, the vivid detail being the most important asset. Direct quotes from people, the way they dressed. Isak's tailored 70s suits in Darfur, The way Claudetta carried herself and flaunted her distinctive Sierra Leonean style when she confidently walked down the streets of Freetown. How Charles cocked his head to one side when he would ask me a question. At the time, I didn't realize how valuable these notes would be, but without them, I wouldn't be able to reconstruct where I had been, the images, the motions, the voices. I wanted readers to see firsthand the people who I had met, feel what it was like to live in these places, and without these notes, it would not have been possible. Details fade, especially after you've been in a place for a while. So it was important to record these things early on when they were fresh and my senses were heightened to them. The dewy smell of the house in Rwanda when Mary was cooking chicken legs. The weight of the hot Darfur sand on my feet trudging to work. The white wispy smoke that spilled up from the sides of the street when Freetowners burned their trash. The viscosity of the mango juice I drank in Sudan. The way a diesel engine sounded when we revved through a dry waterbed. Without these, the scenes would fall flat. And it's important to jot down everything when you first arrive, when things are fresh, when the walk back to your home still feels new and exciting, when you're noticing things which in a few weeks will become routine. It's easy for things to become one big blur, and for days to meld into one another. And I recorded not only what was around me, but how it made me feel, how I reacted. Because my early reactions in this career were so different from how I would react later to the same events. How poverty and suffering became more of a backdrop to my profession later along in my career. But at the beginning, I looked at it mouth agape, incredulous to what I was seeing. This hardening was an important part of my personal development in the book, and I would read back passages I wrote during those early years and be amazed at my naivete. These were important reference points to chart my own growth, which were critical to building the arc of the book. And while the stories made these places come to life, it was also important to me to blend facts, situational reporting into the book. In my opening tonight, I read you a bunch of statistics. I'm not sure you'll remember any of them. But you probably will remember more what I told you about the Filipino families rebuilding their homes only a day after the typhoon. This is what readers want to read. These are the images that stay with people. So I looked at the writing process on two levels. One was to plainly explain to the reader the events that were happening at the time. And that came with research, reading, history books, and articles. I needed substance and fact to put my stories into a historical context. I'd spend usually the entire day reading, taking notes, and then typing them up. And often I'd had one document of just facts and historical references, and another of the experiences that I had in those places. And then the work really began, of merging the dry background with my own narrative and perspective. One challenge I constantly faced was writing about the humanitarian world objectively, while also being an insider of that world. I wanted to provide an honest reflection about what we do, who we are, how we work, the limits to our interventions, in a way that didn't let us get off the hook for our ineffectiveness or inefficiency, but also didn't turn readers off to humanitarian aid completely. I wanted people to understand the real logistical challenges we face and to know that our work is never straightforward or as simple as it's sometimes portrayed by the media. But I also wanted to hold us to account and call us out when our interventions failed. So finding the right balance between these voices was tricky and needed a lot of combing through again and again. And it was only by sharing drafts with people who didn't know anything about my work that I could get some objectivity on my tone. I would usually start out writing a passage harshly condemning aid, and it was only after a good friend would read it to tell me I sounded like a self-righteous jerk. Or I'd write a passage too defensive of a screw-up, feeling protective of my colleagues and the work we did, knowing that their errors were not intentional and were done with the best intentions in mind. But again, I needed external readers to help me realize that I was sounding too defensive. And with this insight, I could peel back the layers and explain more plainly to the reader so that the reader could make up his or her own mind. There were many misconceptions I had about writing when I first ventured into this. First was that writing a book, or writing anything for that matter, takes much longer than you think. My best friend is a journalist, and she was the one who initially encouraged me to organize my emails home into some semblance of a book proposal. I told her I could probably push out a draft in 6 months or so. She chuckled. "What?" I asked her. All the stories were in my head, in my journals, and emails home to my friends and family. It just took a matter of getting them together. How hard could that be? Well, writing the book took me 5 years. It was a process of draft after draft, of reading my own words so many times that I could recite whole paragraphs from memory. Writing is revising, being brave enough to send your most rambling drivel to a friend, revising again, stepping away, sometimes for weeks at a time, to get some perspective or a jolt of inspiration from somewhere, from how the breeze lifts your curtains in your bedroom, to how the subway smells, to an interaction with a coffee vendor, coming back and revising again, adding more detail, scratching unnecessary detail, revising and improving again. But I will say, if you are going to embark on writing, just get it down. Get anything down. Write and don't stop yourself or self-edit while you're writing. Write raw. Write as though no one's ever going to read what you've written. There were many times when I considered quitting because I'd start a passage about a time I screwed up at work and think about a future boss reading it. I thought about that raunchy line on page 126 and cringed thinking about my dad reading it. I thought about my friends knowing some of my worst behaviors during times when no one was watching, feeling ashamed that not only they, but every future reader would know my weakest days, my most private thoughts. But those rawest moments, I found, were the ones that people remember most about the book. They're what make me as a writer relatable, vulnerable, and someone that people can identify with. You can always go back and edit later if you think you won't be able to make eye contact with your Uncle Greg over Thanksgiving after he reads about your affair with a hot colleague. Just get it down. Get the words down, get a draft down. You'll have plenty of time to go back and revise, and you will for months. And you will work on it for years more after that. Books happen in phases, and they can always get better. And it's really more about work than talent. Accept that your first drafts will be terrible, but it's far less scary to sculpt something when you actually have something to sculpt with. Writing is a lonely process, and it's easy to get caught up in your head. I second-guess myself all the time. I'm not really an author. I'm not even a journalist. What do I know? Who cares about my experience? What do I have to contribute? There were blogs, websites, articles, even some books related to my subject. What was my voice going to bring? But I revisited that Toni Morrison directive. I couldn't find a book telling the stories I wanted to tell, which leads me to my next piece of advice. Say something new. Even one new thing is something new. Even if your book is not perfectly written, if it says something new, it has value in the world. Push yourself to say something new and in a new way. And know that writing is hard for everyone, even experienced writers. Not just hard, but sometimes miserable. Not just miserable, but I've seen writing books ruin some people's lives. And that should be both heartening, but give you perspective on why you're doing it. It's hard and it's not fun, and expect to feel a lot of self-doubt and to wonder if you should drop out. But if you're considering writing, hold on to that light, the subject or compulsion that moved you in the first place, and return to that and find whatever you need, notes, photos, a trip to the ocean, to remember that the story you're telling matters more than all the naysayers around you or the ones in your head. Earlier, I talked about what I had hoped you walked away from reading my book. If you have clear goals of what you want the reader to know and understand from your story, it makes those miserable days a bit easier, because you revisit why you set out to do this and you have a purpose. Write that purpose down. Tape it to your wall. Put it as a sticky on the side of your screen. It sounds like a cliche, but listen to your heart and intuition. They are your guides. And what helped me was mapping my story at the beginning and knowing that it would change. I needed a strong sense of where I was going and how I was going to get there, but I was open to adjusting that map. I used old-fashioned color-coded 3x5 note cards and charted each chapter to understand how it fit and build my overall arc. How was each chapter building from one to another? And what was the stitching that held each chapter together? Transitions were especially tricky. How would I get the reader from Rwanda to New York, from New York to Darfur, from Darfur to Sri Lanka, etc.? And I used these transitions, the moments back at home, as a continual anchor to chart my own personal growth and how I was changing from who I was when I started out in this line of work, from a wide-eyed idealist to a more realistic and hardened professional. If you're attempting to write, it's a cliche that you should write every day. But seriously, write every day. Even write for an hour. Don't look at Facebook or check your email for 1 hour every day. So much writing can be done in a year if you do it every day. But unless you've been writing all your life in long form, you may not yet know your writing process. It's different for everyone, and you will learn as you write. Some people get up at 4 a.m., some force themselves to write 1,000 words a day. For me, I would just purge a lot of garbage, like a mush of paints on a palette, and then feel totally disgusted with myself, thinking I'm not really working and just wasting time. But a few days, maybe a week, maybe even a month later, I pulled the gold out in one massive hours-long writing binge. That's me. And before I understood that this was my process, I hated myself for it, or thought I was just being lazy, because I thought that the months-long lead-up was just procrastination. Now I know that that's how my brain works, and I learned to trust it. And it's important to know the difference between procrastination and time for your work ideas, to let your work and ideas percolate. A book is a serious endeavor, and it's okay to let your thinking percolate. It'll make a better book. There's a rush to see it done, and there may be reasons that you're pressured to get it done, but don't discount the power of letting yourself take the time to really think about it. Join a writing circle and have people read your work. I joined a writing group in New York. It was a random cross-section of New Yorkers who gave me honest feedback, a lot of which was completely unexpected. Things I thought they'd hate, they loved. Things I thought they'd think were funny, they found offensive. You need help, ask for it. Read, 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 read. Because when you're a reader, you know what you like to read, and you know if your book is a book that you'd want to read. I read every book like mine, every travel book, from Elizabeth Gilbert's Eat, Pray, Love about romance and Italian food, to Sebastian Junger's War, and then I read more. I read memoirs that had nothing to do with my subject, like Mary Carr's Lit, about her alcoholic upbringing, to see how talented writers talked about their lives. Read poems, read good prose, stop and really listen to music that moves you. It's not just inspiring, it's an ongoing conversation you're having with the world, and ideas, and other people's apprehension of it. And yeah, when you're stuck, crack open a book that's outside your subject, but a good book, and read a few pages, and then go for it. You will not make money from writing a book. Trust me. People will tell you to get a real job, or they'll roll your eyes and look at you with gentle pity and compassion when you tell them that you're writing a book. This is a real job. Don't forget, even if they pay you peanuts or nothing at all, and even if it takes a really long time. But the publishing industry is not as exclusive or scary as you think. I knew no one in this field when I started out. I went in completely blind, and I was rejected plenty of times. But it only takes one person, and if you produce something good, you'll find that person, or he or she will find you. And don't be afraid to call your heroes, and this goes for whatever profession you're setting out to do. My friend who wanted to be a journalist called a New York Times reporter when she was 21 because she loved his book, and he talked to her for an hour. You'll realize that they're human and their lives are attainable, and you may make a lasting connection. That said, a deadline is a good thing. We can all spend 10 more years making a draft better, and I had heard once that you're only ever putting out a rough draft. At some point, be ready to put your pen down. You're sitting in such a privileged position, and there are things I wish someone told me when I was a freshman, and also would have contributed to me being a better, smarter writer. Because you need to be an engaged member of the world to write. You need practice observing, thinking, and processing. Here are a few things I wish someone had told me when I was sitting in your place. Get involved, like really involved. Make commitments and keep them. Be part of your new community. Join every club, sign up for every sport, take any class that you've always wanted to but weren't sure, felt too insecure for whatever reason. This is the time to try things you've always wanted to. It's hard for me not to be generic and trite, but find a balance between try everything and become an expert in something. Early on, it's important to cast a wide net and explore what interests you, but it's also a great chance to do deep learning and hone a technical skill that you can carry forward, or at least to clarify what you think that skill will be. That will give you confidence to pursue what you really want. Go to your professor's office hours. Get to know them. Ask the questions you're too embarrassed to ask in class. Have a conversation. That's what they're there for and are paid for. It's a luxury to have these minds at your disposal. Take advantage of it. Do something big with your summers. If you have the means, travel. Explore. Not everyone feels entitled to go or work abroad, but anyone can do it. Go for a year if you can. You're not going to miss as much as you think. Get jobs and internships that will lead to connections, insights into what your field of interest is really about and whether or not you're really interested in going into it. Right now, there are all these careers you never even considered and don't know about, like I didn't know about humanitarian aid. Try and find out about them. Do as many hands-on internships as possible to see what it's really like to work somewhere and to make connections. And the experiences where I learned the most were ones where I was immersed in a challenging and usually far-flung context, to see how things really got done in the real world. I would say avoid offices and sitting at desks if possible. Those will come easily later. Value your friendships. You're probably living away from home for the first time, and these friends become family. Make 1 or 2 really good friendships, otherwise none of the social stuff will really matter much, except for meeting people who will expand your sense of the world and things you can do with your life. Don't be apathetic. The world is really in a state of disarray. Read the newspaper. Get off your dorm room hallway. There's a whole campus, a whole city to explore. And remember that this freedom ends. Be creative with your time now. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're gonna get the Q&A warmed up with a question from Facebook, I guess this is. Right? Emily Smith wants to know, Emily Smith says, I commend the amount of vulnerability you demonstrated throughout your book. I was wondering, did you have any hesitations about putting yourself out there for others? If so, how did you overcome those feelings of anxiety?
Well, I think I touched a little bit about on this in the talk, but yes, absolutely. I mean, I self-edited multiple times and was terrified about what people were going to think of me and being so vulnerable about what I was saying, about my most inner thoughts and experiences. But how I overcame those anxieties or those hesitations was knowing that it would make a much richer book if I actually put that in there. And, scrubbing it out would make it really kind of bland. And the scenes that people most resonated with were the times where I was most vulnerable, when I was human and relatable. And I think that as a character of the book, and as a trusted narrator to get people from all these different places I was working, I needed to be a character that people could relate to. And that was the only way that I found that they could do so.
Any questions on this side? Anybody want a question? Oh, up there. All right.
Hi, I'm Jack. I'm from New York City.
Hi.
My question was, the thing that bothered me when I finished the book was that in the short term, it seemed that the aid agencies really seemed to help. They saved lives and gave needed supplies. But in the long term, there didn't seem to be an effort to phase out the aid agencies. And
To what?
to phase out the aid agencies. And because of that, there started to be a reliance on the agencies in these communities. So and you mentioned this towards the end of the book, but what are the aid agencies doing to combat that?
Absolutely. I mean, well, one of the things that is just naturally combating that is that we're on an unsustainable trajectory as is. I mean, there's only limited funding for humanitarian aid agencies to operate, and so there's limited funding, and so we're having to close operations anyway. But I work in the policy branch for the United Nations now, and one of the things that we're really working on is entering with an exit, and so knowing what our exit strategy is going to be as soon as we enter, so that we're not there for years and years, because humanitarian assistance is really for crises. But if you're there for 17 years, is that really humanitarian assistance anymore? I mean, or are we now venturing into more development and long-term sustainable aid that doesn't really qualify as humanitarian aid anymore? And so identifying at what point do we now transition to the government or to development actors is something that not only are we talking about, but is becoming more and more a reality of how we operate. So identifying that exit point as soon as we get there so that we're not perpetuating our own existence in these countries until, 17 years later, when, in fact, our remit should be only a few years. So at the policy level, it's being discussed, but actually at the implementation level, it's becoming more of a reality just because funding is being cut anyway, but also people are recognizing that this is just an unsustainable way of operating. So thanks for your question.
Hi, my name is Kelsey Paul, and I'm from Bayonne, New Jersey.
Sorry, I can't really hear you.
I don't know if this. Oh, okay. Hi, my name is Kelsey Paul, and I am from Bayonne, New Jersey. Recently, a photograph of a drowned Syrian boy took the world by storm. People were moved by the innocent, helpless child. In your speech, you mentioned that the media makes people of crises appear helpless. So, what is the most effective way for American media to relay a crisis that would help us as a nation to begin to understand what's happening miles away? How should the media have presented the picture of the Syrian boy differently?
Well, first of all, I've been, for the last couple of weeks, just completely focused on personal matters. So I haven't really read the newspaper in the last couple of weeks myself, but I do know about the image, and there was a lot of discussion on social media of whether that image was actually appropriate, whether it was actually totally undignified to have that image be sent all over the world. But what it did do was spur a reaction, an international reaction. So I think there are arguments for and against, what that image did. But I think, and I think in the Post yesterday, there was, stories about 5 refugees who were coming from Syria and what their stories were, which I thought was really good. I mean, because it gave sort of a human element to some of the statistics that we're seeing. I mean, it's really hard to put into people's minds what it actually means for individuals and families who are fleeing, unless you can, identify with their actual stories. But so often there's these short little sound bites that don't give depth to what people are experiencing, and so it's hard for people to relate or understand what they're doing. So I do think, part of my writing the book was I found that the media was so unsophisticated in their reporting of the aftermath of the Haiti earthquake. And it was so black and white. Either the aid agencies were doing nothing and they were terrible and they're, totally corrupt, and why wasn't the rebuilding happen yet? Or it was so misguided and really lacking the kind of sophistication to go into some of the real nuance that I think my book tried to do, of explaining what the challenges were to rebuilding, or why it was so difficult to get things moving. And that wasn't necessarily the fault of aid agencies or the government, but it was just sort of circumstantial in the contextual reality in which we were working. And so for the media, I would say just providing human stories like the ones that they were doing about those people, but going into some more depth. And, long-form journalism is sort of dying. I mean, and that's sad reality of today's, short sound bites. But I think it's important to keep that up, because that's the only way that people really understand the true reality of what's going on in these places.
Yeah?
Okay,
Sure.
okay, so my name is Tara, I'm from New Jersey. Kind of going off her question, I know you mentioned a lot in your book how, the way the media portrays everything in the aid agencies, and, the Russian donations can sometimes do more harm than good. And with the photo of the Syrian boy, I've seen, a lot of things going, how can you help, how can you help? If you've been reading up on that, what is your opinion on that, and which ways do you think can actually help, and which ways do you think would actually do more harm than good?
Well, I mean, I think the real way, and it's when people are washing up on the shores of European countries. I mean, it's almost too late in a way. I mean, because think about all the other people who have perished along the way, and it took that to really jill people into action. And the Syria crisis and many of these other crises have their roots in political stalemates, and nothing's been done to solve the Syria crisis. And it's up to, European nations, the U.S., et cetera, to resolve that conflict so that people don't have the need to flee in the first place. And so, I mean, I think in order to help, what people like you can do is advocating for a resolution to the conflict that's making people flee in the first place. And, you know, it's up to Europeans and other people to open their doors to refugees who are coming, which many nations are currently doing.
And we have a question up here.
Hi, I'm Charlotte.
Where are you?
Right here.
Okay, hi.
Hi, I'm Charlotte. I'm from Lenox, Massachusetts, which you actually mentioned in your book, which
Yeah.
is exciting. My question is, in all of your years of aid work, what was your lowest moment and what was your best moment?
Well, I think I start the book out with my lowest moment, where I'm totally burnt out in Darfur. So I would say that was my lowest moment. My highest moment, gosh. I don't know whether I can distill it down into one, but I would say, you know, just general interactions with people who are affected by crisis there, you know, in the field. I don't have one particular moment that was the highest, but you know, every kind of relationship that I've carried on since with people that you meet there have been some of the highest moments of this career, which is why, you know, even with all of the challenges, the burnout, the things that you face personally and professionally, I mean, it's those sort of one-on-one interactions that make it really worthwhile and why you continue to do the work in the first place.
We have a question back here.
Where are you?
Hi, Miss Alexander. I'm Kim. I'm from Vancouver, Canada. And I actually, given your experience as an aid worker, you're an expert as an aid worker, I wanted to get your take on volunteerism. So I think, you know, we all know that volunteering abroad is sort of a rite of passage these days. We all build houses in foreign countries and go do pre-med volunteering. And my question is, I think, like, you know, there's a lot of critiques of it, that it's neo-colonial, it's for instant gratification. And what I want to know is whether you think there is still some value in, like, a college-age and relatively unskilled worker doing volunteerism, and if not, what you think we as college students could do instead.
No, that's a great question. I mean, I think there is value to going overseas. I wouldn't call it volunteerism. I mean, if you're going, you should be volunteering, not being a tourist. So it's finding a reputable agency and identifying what your skill set is that you can bring to an affected area or a place where you can actually add value. I think what people are turned off to is when people without skills, or people may have skills but they're doing something that can be done by a local person in the context just as well, and replacing that person. So before you go, thinking about really critically, am I bringing something that someone there can't already do? So whether it's showing up in the Philippines and helping to clear rubble, which people were being paid as a job, so local Filipinos were being paid to actually do that. An unintended consequence of that is putting local people out of potential jobs or income generation activities at a time when they need it most. So it's not that, you know, all volunteering is bad or all volunteering is good. I mean, there's shades of gray, and it depends really on the organization that you're going with and identifying what the skill is that you're bringing to the place. I would say if you are going that it's important to make a time commitment, because that's the only way that you will make an impactful, you will have impact in the place that you're going. I would say, you know, 1 week off trip, really think about what the value that you're adding to that and whether it is for you as a person, for your own personal development, which is fine. I would say then go as a tourist and don't, you know, go under the guise of I'm going to be doing good. But there is absolute value in traveling and exploring and coming back to your university or your career with a new perspective about the world and people else who are out there. And it's also important, if this is a career that you want to embark in, getting that kind of experience and exposure is also important. But it's recognizing why you're doing it in the first place and being honest with yourself about why you're going as well. I mean, part of my turn off to those volunteerists, whereas it seemed a lot more about them than it was about the people.
Don't.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm from a suburb of Philadelphia, not far from UPenn. My question is, you talked about the journals that you kept of different people you met in your work. Do you still keep in touch with anyone you
I do.
work with?
Yes, I keep in touch with a number of the people there. Not necessarily the people I wrote about disparagingly, but certainly a number of the characters. Absolutely, I do. Yeah.
Here we go. Yeah, okay. Question who? There you go.
Hi Jessica, my name is Cole Trask and I'm from Orlando, Florida. And I just want to ask, how effective and productive do you feel your work at the United Nations is versus the hands-on work you previously did in the field?
It's very different. I would, working in an office in a big bureaucracy, it's easy to feel like you're pushing paper and sending emails and not doing much. I do get to the field once in a while in the job, but I would say it's very different than being, there and it's hard to remember sometimes that you're actually working in a field that's impacting people because you're like layers upon layers upon layers removed from, influencing that family that I wrote about or talked about in this speech. So I know that the work that I'm doing and the work that is being done at headquarters is part of the whole system, but on an individual or personal level, absolutely, you don't feel by any means as impactful as you do working in the ground. It's certainly intellectually stimulating and rewarding to be engaged in these issues and talking about them and writing about them and reading about them at work, but actually meeting people and being closer to the field is where you get the most rewards for your work because you're actually seeing what it's leading to, whereas it's very hard to do so in an air-conditioned cubicle in New York or Geneva. Yeah.
We have a question up here.
Sorry.
Hi, my name's Nathan. I'm from San Francisco, California.
Woo!
Yeah. One of the things that really struck me about your book was when you're having that conversation with one of your colleagues, Katrin, and you said that you're staying with a Rwandan family, and she said, "Oh, do you want me to hide any of your valuables?"
Right.
And I thought that was really interesting because even though she's volunteering and working with these people, I felt that she had some sense of superiority. Did you ever feel that some of your colleagues kind of felt superior to these people that they're helping, or that there was some racism that was being projected at this time?
Sure. Yeah, and she wasn't volunteering. She was an employee of the UN, which is, I was doing an internship there, so I was more of the volunteer, but she was working there. But, I think that some people, but I wouldn't say that that's across the board. I think I was portraying her and some other characters as representative of what you can find there, and I think my other colleague, I forget the name that I used for him in the book, I know his name, but he was more so. I think he was the one who said, how do these mothers keep their children apart? Don't they all look the same to you or something like that? And that's when I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that someone who's working in this field, the head of the office, actually made that kind of statement. And so you do see it in sort of certain people or slices, and people are weird and they come into this field for all different kinds of reasons. Some of them to have a lifestyle that's much better that they could afford back in their own countries, or they're escaping something at home or whatever. But I don't think that it's across the board, but certainly you see it in some people.
Hi. Sorry. I'm Zach. I'm from Minnesota. You touched on the realm of people going to these countries to volunteer, but ending up just taking pictures and posting them on social media. So can you touch on the white saviorship complex a little bit more?
Yeah, I think my issue with that, and I saw it a lot in Haiti, is that you think that, and I touch upon it in the speech as well, and this goes not only for volunteers coming in, but also aid professionals, and this is shifting now of people thinking that we're coming in with all of the answers and that we're coming in swooping in to save the day, where in fact, people are the most resourceful and resilient, and it's their responses that we should be empowering, not ours the other way around. And so this white savior complex of us coming in and giving a handout is really being turned on its head now, not only in the policy level that I'm working at, but at the ground. We're recognizing that local NGOs, the local government, the affected people themselves are the first responders, the ones who are really the ones responsible for the response at the end of the day, and that they may need our support, but we're not the answers and we're not the saviors. And so it really, and this goes back to the other question about volunteerism, but is this about you and your Facebook feed and this amazing experience that you're having, or is this really about what the affected people actually need and want? And how demeaning would that be if it was you and your family who were experiencing a crisis and some foreigners were coming in and taking pictures and tramping around your new home, taking pictures and handing out candy as though you were a zoo animal?
Hi, I'm Mike Talbert from Tampa, Florida. And I had a question on the structure of your book. You start with Darfur, and then you travel around, and then you go back to Darfur. I was just wondering, like a structuring standpoint, how come you did that?
So, it wasn't, that chapter is very short, right, which you noticed as well, and it was really the kind of shock and awe chapter, because I wanted the reader to know that this wasn't going to be a, oh my God, I work in humanitarian aid and I'm so amazing and I save the world. No, I start out saying, I'm about to throw rocks at children, like at the height of my burnout, right? So to give the reader an understanding of where I was coming from and to it was a hook, sort of, to get readers into the book. And the main message was, or one of the main messages was about, this isn't as straightforward as it may seem, and aid work isn't just this Pollyanna, nice work that we do, that there's real points of burnout and also these ethical dilemmas that you're faced with constantly. And so it wasn't a choice necessarily of trying to confuse the reader and go from Darfur to another, but to say, this is sort of where you're going, reader. This isn't, and if you remember, I sort of end that short opening with like, I'm about to throw rocks at kids and being like, what am I doing? To, the next line being, you're like Mother Teresa, you're so amazing. And the contrast of those two was really the intent. So that was kind of the opener, or the anchor to get people engaged, and then it went chronologically. So that was sort of more of the regular arc. Two more?
We have a question up here.
Where? Okay, hi.
Hi, I'm Nancy from Thailand.
Wow.
Yeah. I've been wanting to ask this question since I finished the book, and I just wanted to ask, how is Charles? And Jack.
Sorry?
I wanted to ask, how is Charles
Right.
and Jack? And have you met them after you read your book? After you wrote your book?
Yes. So, I haven't really talked to Charles in a really long time, and his name is Lawrence, actually. Everyone close? But I saw him, yes, definitely after I wrote the book, and I gave him like an unedited proof before it was ready to just get his okay on the parts that were written about him, and then the book, I gave him like a copy after, but he's doing well. He's good, yeah.
One more from the floor.
Hello, my name is German. I'm from New York City, and I'm not gonna go into depth. So I have a question. Your parents were my favorite characters in the book. So
I'm sorry?
I wanted to know, did your dad have a big influence on you leaving the field?
Leaving the field, like coming home.
Right, or getting a regular type of job?
No, I think he would have, if I had left the field much earlier in my career, it would have been because of him. But I think he sort of became more comfortable with where I was living, the choices I was making later. So it wasn't him at that point. It was really my own, like, I've really got to go home and figure out, my personal life, really. And that I wasn't going to be able to do that hopping from one crisis to another. But he has played an enormous role in my personal life, as you read in the book, and also sort of served as a real anchor to my crazy professional, scattered, peripatetic existence as well. So, but he wasn't really the reason I ultimately came.
Please join me in thanking our guest author.
Thank you.